All right, good morning, everyone. Thank you again for joining us on this Monday morning. I would like to thank Dr. Eiler and the Kaiser Marston for sponsoring this webinar. And with that, I will turn that over to Rob. Thank you.
Thanks, Vicki. And I want to thank Chabin and Kaiser Marston also. And folks, remember to put questions in the chat box if you have them, and then Vicki will come back after I complete my time today and ask some of the questions that you ask. Hope everybody's doing okay. Let's get started. The agenda today is to kind of go through the macro economy and update y'all on some of the data that's come out since the last time, or if this is your first time, what's happened over the last few weeks. US data came out early June or early July about June, about 11.1% unemployment, still about 13 million people out of work since June 2019. And economists do annual comparisons to try to take the seasonality out of the data. In California, we're at 15.1% unemployment as of June. These data just came out on Friday. At about 2.465 million people have lost their jobs since last June. So one of the things that's also been concerning, and I'll talk about this over the next 20 minutes or so in different spots, is the concerns over reopening and then going backwards, and then what that means going forward. Certainly the rollback in California in certain counties and in certain industries is not good. But it does foreshadow the idea that we are still not out of the woods yet, and that the coming months and quarters are still going to be times of recovery. The idea that we're going to have a V-shaped recovery is starting to fade relatively quickly, but that doesn't mean that we're in for a depression. So the key right now is how we continue to slowly reopen and move toward some vaccine, with the idea that that would eliminate a lot of uncertainty, and I'll come back to that in a minute. The forecasts are evolving positively, mainly because we're all sort of gearing up for an overall better level of certainty of a vaccine or something to come and wash away a lot of that uncertainty with respect to having more disease. But we're going to see the forecast get a little bit weird probably going into the third quarter if we don't have more full reopening, or if the election becomes a lot more uncertain in terms of its outcome. One of the things we're watching also very closely in terms of policy is unemployment insurance and its potential extension of the augmentation provided by the federal government initially in this episode, and whether or not we're going to see another relatively large fiscal stimulus bill and what's going to be inside of it, and how labor markets are ultimately going to react to those changes. And what the focus today, I've been doing some sort of economic and workforce development foci over these seminars. One of the things we're going to talk about today a little bit more in depth is the role of housing in recovery and what that might mean for migration of labor. So folks, here's how recovery works. We know that recessions lead to lost jobs, so then business stability needs to happen, and then workers need to be hired back. Before they're hired back, businesses need to feel like that they can see the future well enough to go back into the labor market and start rehiring. And so there's this sort of domino effect that happens when recession begins, and recovery works by reversing those dominoes in a sense. Businesses become unstable, they let people go. If they remain in business, they wait to see stability. Once they become more stable, they hire workers back. And then the two together stabilize housing and labor markets regionally, because we work in a regional marketplace for labor and also for customers. And the idea here is those things need to work in conjunction with each other to truly get moving forward. And they depend, as I said a little bit earlier, on rising certainty. If uncertainty prevails and it becomes a long-term problem in markets, then businesses remain less stable, and it's a longer duration of unemployment that comes along with that, because businesses are more reticent to hire workers back. And some of the caveats that we've been seeing, at least in this recession, is that we've seen labor force shifting. I'll come back and talk about this when I talk about the California data in more detail, and the potential conversion of labor needs to capital. So those are a couple of things economists are starting to watch a little bit more in the medium term, versus just simply saying, okay, we went on pause for a couple of months, now let's hire everybody back. Believe that there is going to be some, or there are going to be some shifts from labor to capital, and that some folks are simply just going to leave the labor force because they're either going to retire, or they're going to become somewhat discouraged in the possibilities, or they're going to have to leave to then go get an education to re-up their skills. But all that means some jostling in labor markets. On the surface, the data look pretty good at the US level, but that's as of the end of June. And it's critical to understand a couple of things about the labor data. The labor data are generally figured out sometime in the middle of the month, not at the end of the month. End of the month data, which I'll show you in a minute, are more about unemployment insurance claims at the state and local level, and also weekly claims that come out at the federal level that is the amalgam of all the states together. But the idea is that these data are really through the middle of June, not through June 30. However, things got better in June, at least in the beginning, and you can see how the unemployment rate evolved since 1990, again, giving you some historic perspective about what's happened just on the last few months and some of the recovery. As you can see, it went straight up and has come straight back in that shaded area. To give you a little bit more focus in the last few years, this is what unemployment's looked like since January 2018. And you can see the movement going forward, and then you can see in that shaded area that the rise very quickly up in April, which is the spike, May a click down, and June a click down. So with the rollbacks we've seen in some states, and we're expecting more over the next couple of weeks, we might see this progression flatten a little bit, which is okay. In the sense, historically speaking, unemployment rarely goes all the way up and then suddenly goes back. That's the importance of that last graph historically. I'm just going to go back there very quickly. Notice it's very rare, specifically in the last 3 recessions, where we kind of had the flavor of all potential recessions show up, and I'll come back to this later also. It goes up, and then it sort of slowly meanders down. The idea it was going to, in an upward, upside down V, go straight up and straight back down, historically and theoretically just doesn't work for most economists. However, one piece of data to watch very closely that's going to get a lot more maybe focal energy in the news is what's called permanent job losses. So in recessions, and these are the last 2 recessions, the data only really started being counted in this idea from 1994 forward. We're measuring here job losses that come along with business losses, in the sense the job you lost no longer exists, in that the business that you used to work for or the technology you used to work for no longer exists. So what happens usually is that recessions are, in a sense, have a foundation of demand shock, supply shock, and then reallocation shock, meaning that demand can sag, then supply contracts when businesses are lost, but then also workers are reallocating themselves from their old skill base to a new one, meaning that, well, okay, so I did not have a college degree and I worked with that for 15 years. Now I got a college degree, so I reallocated my skill base to another type of employment. Permanent job loss is meant to sort of measure some of those parts in which we just don't expect much to come back at all in the old skills. Now notice that what happens is that recession leads to permanent job loss, and then as new technologies or new types of jobs start to come on market, the permanent jobs loss fades, because the folks that otherwise would have lost their job permanently find a job some other place through that so-called reallocation, or a rise in supply, or a rise in demand. When this is going up, it means that we are losing more jobs than we're gaining. Like I say in the title of this, there's net of job gains. And until we see this peak off, we're going to assume that the businesses are still being lost in the American economy. We haven't seen the capacity of the economy coming back. This is something I've been warning about for the last few months, is we cannot lose the capacity of the economy. In a sense, these data are meant to show that by the nature of how unemployment is taking place. So right now, just under 3 million people have a permanent job loss through June 2020. Now let's look at the claims data, because these data are a little bit more recent. This is through the 11th of July. And here's the movement in the US. So we saw, this is from February 1st forward. We see it spike in late March. In April, we see it start to decline, and then somewhat flatten out, because the economy in this first round, we saw people stop losing their jobs generally, but not necessarily a shut off of people losing their jobs. And these data, and it's very important to say this, these data are new unemployment insurance claims, not continuing claims. It's a very, very subtle dichotomy there. The initial claims are people that are newly coming on the line to get unemployment insurance. And somebody who got rehired who lost their job in late March will no longer show in these data after late March, but do show up in March. Difference in continuing claims is that when somebody lost their job in March, you won't see them in the data once they get a job, when they get their job back anymore. So these are the US data about people that are newly coming on to unemployment insurance, and we want to see this continue to descend. Now, California's got a little bit different story. California kind of looked the same as the US in the beginning of the recession, fell down, but has wobbled a little bit in terms of it actually picking back up a little bit in June, and then flattening a little bit going into July for now. The recent rollbacks in California suggest that as we see the new weekly claims come forward in the next couple of weeks, we might see this pick back up again, as there might be new job losses, specifically in those industries that have experienced rollback in the counties in which they've rolled back. Let's look at the continued claims now, which is, again, a subtle difference from the data we just looked at. These are the total number of weeks that unemployment insurance is being paid in a month. And these are usually seasonally adjusted. This is the US, and you can see it go way up and continue to climb, right? So the spike in unemployment insurance initial claims rises faster or earlier to its peak than continued claims do, because continued claims are usually seen as the culmination of those new claims. It peaked in early May and then fell down sharply in mid-May, but then flattened out and then has been going on the slow gradient back down. But it's still, the left-hand axis are the data on this one, somewhere around the 17 million level. For California, similar situation, peaked a little bit before the US, but then fell down, went back up again, similar to the US, fell down and then went back up again, has been wobbling around 3 million for the last few weeks that the data are available. These data are actually only available through the end of June for right now for California. The idea here, though, and it's very, again, important, we need these data also go down, but these usually do go down more slowly than initial claims, because this is how people linger on unemployment. So initial claims for unemployment insurance are how people get into unemployment insurance. Continued claims are how long we're paying unemployment insurance to folks that have applied and continue to be eligible. So the longer this lingers at relatively high levels, the longer the duration of unemployment, at least in theory. Let's look at the types of jobs lost at the US level in June. And these data showcase that we still have a lot of problems in personal services. Looking at the far right-hand side, none of these industry sectors are showing positive growth since the previous year yet. I'll come back to California in a little bit. You can see on the far left-hand side that personal services have come back. Once haircut, hair salons opened up, everybody raced and got a haircut or got their hair done. So we saw the jobs pick quickly up from the original lows. But restaurants and bars are still slowly rehiring, because a lot of those jobs are permanently lost, as well as hotels. As people are traveling a little bit more, some of those jobs have picked back up. But again, those are maybe representative of permanent losses. So how long those linger will tell us a story about the number of businesses that remain in those sectors. The other sectors are slowly climbing back up, which is good to see. The non-farm employment cut since last year is only about 8.6% right now at the national level, which is also good. Now, all those data kind of feed into recent forecasts. So this is a forecast as of just last Friday. The New York Federal Reserve is doing a high frequency forecast of GDP to try to stay on whatever data might be available. And those line items, and you can see that very top thing with housing, construction, manufacturing, surveys, retail and consumption, et cetera. Those are the components of their data. And the final Q2 2020 forecast out of this group was negative 14.3 in the second quarter. We knew the second quarter of 2020 was going to be the ugly quarter. You can see that initially the forecast was bad, and it's been picking up in June. So these data are from February 28 forward, basically the sort of time in which you're forecasting the next quarter on through to the end of the last quarter, and then getting the final data to come in. You can see it was really nasty in May. It's been climbing up in June, and in early July, it's somewhat flattened out. So there's a cautionary tale that maybe we're starting to peak a little bit in terms of recovery for right now. But the third quarter looks pretty good in the sense that their forecast is suggesting 13.2% growth in the third quarter, which is going to be record growth, but that's after record downfall. So this has also been climbing. The idea is the forecasts still are with the idea that we are going to recover in a more continuous fashion rather than, let's say, a up and down fashion. And if we don't have recovery that's relatively continuous, we're going to see these forecasts fade. We're going to hear about the second quarter of 2020 here in the next 10 days or so, and coming out of the Bureau of Economic Analysis, which is the official declaration of what happened in terms of estimated growth in each quarter of GDP at the US level. And that's going to set the tone for some of these forecasts and also for how businesses are looking forward. Two words that I've been talking about since the first time we did this was depth and duration, and we're still in the mode of looking how deep this is going to be. So for California, the data have also gotten better. So the first column of data shows the number of people that have lost their job and in terms of the negative numbers, and then the change in those data. The labor force is still something to watch. 2.1% of the labor force has been lost in California since last June, and unemployment's 15.1. In May, it was 4.4% versus last June. So folks have either re-entered the labor force, or we've seen at least some slowdown in seasonally adjusted way to how many people are leaving the labor force. With respect to unemployment, we've seen some get back, which has been good. The number of jobs that have been lost since last year is down significantly from the comparison in May. So these data all look pretty good for California. But remember, the caveat here, these data are counted in the middle of June. These are not through June 30. Jobs lost, kind of a similar picture to the US. You can see on the far right-hand side, the percentages are larger for things like personal services or what we call other services, restaurants and bars, and then also a bunch of other, let's say, attractions or other tourism services. But accommodation, food services, bars, restaurants, and hotels are still relatively far down. On the other side, if you swing over to the far left, we've seen some pretty good things happening in terms of finance, transportation, construction. All those have come back really strong from their original lows, which is good. It suggests reopening is working, at least through the dates that these data represent. Another piece of data that suggests that this is helping some of these industries and we haven't seen as low or as deep a problem is because PPP worked. So you remember when we had these so-called PPP or Paycheck Protection Plan loans? These data came out of the US Treasury since about 2-3 weeks ago. And it suggests the types of industries and the percentage of the dollars in California that were moved around in the PPP lending by industry. So professional technical services, healthcare, other services, those big losses in personal services, accommodation, food services, hotels, bars and restaurants, retail, construction were the big ones. You might say, well, what's up with professional and technical services? They didn't lose that many jobs. Well, one of the things to recognize is that the PPP lending, and this is less than 150,000, so these are smaller businesses, did not have a whole lot of criteria as to who got the loans or not. So more sophisticated businesses may have applied for those loans and got them. Whether or not they needed them, quote unquote, as much as other businesses that are struggling is going to be a great piece of research for decades to come, and millions of pages I'm sure will be written about it. But regardless, these are the data from Treasury of June 30 as to who got the lending. So you could say that about 27% of that was in more, let's say, advanced skill jobs, but that's how the money was distributed. For the larger lending, this is what it looked like in California. So this is where you saw accommodation and food services, so hotels, bars, and restaurants, and probably a lot of the larger chains that live in California took advantage of this lending, the larger ones being the larger loans. Healthcare, again, the larger hospitals, the larger health systems. Manufacturing, bigger businesses. Professional and technical services, bigger businesses, again. Not as much on the retail side, which you can see retail is smaller in terms of the larger lending. But this, again, paints a picture of the types of jobs that are out there. And this basically follows the number of jobs, not the number of jobs lost. So the idea of PPP was to preserve jobs and ultimately preserve businesses, which is the key to preserving capacity. And one could argue that we have done that in part for now. We will see if we have rollbacks, because we have to potentially, in let's say the ultimate case, shelter in place again, how many of these businesses survive anyway. And that will also be a very highly debated item as time goes forward. If we see more job losses come the third and fourth quarters of this year, where PPP ultimately did not preserve those businesses regardless of what happened, because we had a second round of shelter in place and big rollbacks. One thing to think about is what unemployment is happening around the US. So California, while it is recovering, is still relatively high unemployment in the US, and the darker shaded states are ones that have higher unemployment rates. You can see the US is 13.3, California is 14.9, this is seasonally adjusted. Kentucky is 4.3%. So Kentucky, out of the blue, saw a sharp drop in unemployment. Nebraska last month was the lowest in the US, is just about 6%. But these are going all over the place because depending on how you reopen, the types of businesses that remain, they're all over the place. And Nebraska has now shot back up to something around 9% unemployment, or some about 8.5%. So it's very hard to tell right now, but at least it gives you a comparison about how other states are moving along. And I'll come back to why that's important in a minute. Oregon's 11.1, Washington's 9.8, Nevada's 15. And remember, self-employed are not part of this. So Nevada's shown some really good comeback. But why these data are important is because we're watching housing very closely. We do not want a repeat of what happened in the Great Recession. And every recession is different in how it sort of, the characteristics of how it's come in. 1990-91 was sort of a classic textbook recession. The 2001 recession was dot-com blow up, and then we saw tech companies shed jobs, and that started a recession. The housing crisis in the Great Recession came because of construction changing, and this one came because of social policy. But in all cases, we saw interest rates lowered, and we also saw housing prices fall. Now, the timing right now suggests that housing prices might not fall, but we want to think about the signs when we're watching housing. We're watching listing prices and see if inventory starts to rise. Will construction start to slow down because they see more vacancies and harder time selling houses and stop building? Will rental vacancy go up, feeding that idea? And will the housing crisis we had before, in other words, the shortage of housing actually allow some salvation in this episode? Because if we're already short on supply and demand was higher than supply in the first place, an increase in supply may still not quite get to demand and keep prices stable. And that's a critical factor. We're going to see how things go. But what can be done? Well, we don't want to go back to a housing crisis if we can help. We want construction to continue. We know construction is good in terms of multiplier effects. So when you're thinking about municipal help and how construction can help you out, those multiplier effects are big. But folks, watch for a mix of deferred payments becoming foreclosures and delinquencies on home payments. That's a critical factor. And we will see if fiscal policy comes in later to try to help on that. But why this is important is because if you think about where jobs might be happening in other parts of the country, will people in California look at another state to migrate to, and will that begin a sort of slow but steady slide in housing prices as more and more houses go up or more rental vacancy exists, to allow people to sell their homes, stay in the same place, rent for a little while to let the smoke clear, if you will, and then go back into housing later after prices have, in a sense, reset themselves. Right now, low rental vacancy is probably keeping some people in their homes for now as long as they can afford it, but watch those forces moving against each other, and housing is really the final shoe to drop in this round if we see a longer duration of unemployment and ultimately of recessionary forces. To wrap up, I'm going to talk about housing briefly. This is California housing prices at the median since January 1996, and you can see that the growth is continuing, and these data are through the end of June. So economists are watching very closely to see what's going to happen with median home prices, again, as one of the signs that things are going the wrong way. Here's listing prices. This is only from 2016 forward. This is about 4 years of data, but you can see recently, this is through the end of June, those prices have shot up, suggesting that when people are putting their houses up, they're putting it up at higher prices than the last month with the idea that demand is there. So this is a good sign in the short term that housing prices are not going to take a dip. If you look at housing price growth across some of the larger municipalities, really the larger MSAs in California, the last year has actually been pretty good, about 4% growth since last June. And this is the last 2 years where some of the counties have had a little bit of wild ride over the last couple of years, but are starting to get some comeback. So very little negative in the last year, which is kind of amazing given all the recent convolution that we haven't seen much change in housing prices. But the last couple of years have been a little bit up and down for some of the counties out there, some of the larger ones. Now, this is a little hard to see maybe for you, but I think it tells a tale that all the counties in California right now, Zillow is forecasting through next year all positive growth. Now, all the way on the right-hand side, San Mateo County, very small positive growth, but that's with extremely high prices relative to other parts of California. Sutter County is the highest in this set for now at 4.5% growth, but California's about 2.7% growth through next year, at least according to Zillow. Now, the idea here, though, is that all these prices are positive. That's a change from last month where it was about half and half, and from April where it was about half and half. But nothing huge here in terms of change. And right now, a lot of housing economists see housing prices going slow and steady for California. So that's a good sign for now. But like I said, the housing market is one of the things that's going to give a lot of people a stomach ache going into 2021, because if we don't see jobs come back in earnest, we know housing is going to be a market that's going to want to move negatively as people are making decisions about their careers and about how to generate income, especially if unemployment insurance comes to an end. So what are we watching? Well, we're definitely going to watch labor market changes and how rollbacks start to affect businesses and ultimately another round of job losses if in fact they do. Right now, the rollbacks are in industries that were already hurting a little bit and in a sense, are not necessarily those that pull the economy out toward recovery, but it's still not good, especially for our low-wage workers. So we're going to watch and see whether or not another stimulus package comes in that focuses on those businesses and maybe on those types of workers in terms of providing augmented unemployment insurance for another, let's say, 3 to 6 months. We'll see if that affects labor markets positively. On the housing side, again, that depth and duration is key. Watch for rental vacancy in your area. If rental vacancy starts to go up, maybe by force, it might be you see a little bit more either evictions, which are possible at some point, and then also people losing their jobs and not being able to get their jobs back, and thus the force is more internal, that I just can't afford to stay where I am and I have to go on to some other place. But where are you going to go? So why I showed you that map, there are some pockets of decent job growth around the United States, but how tenuous are those job growth numbers? And how will you make a big change in your life betting that some other place is going to recover better than California? The history of California is that we do end up recovering very, very well when we start to get that momentum. But for right now, it might feel very, very shaky. So thank you for coming again today, Vicki. I will take your questions. Please let me know what we've heard so far.
I'm sorry I was muted. Okay.
Oh, no problem.
Okay. So I don't have any, don't see any questions right now.
Okay.
There's a lot there to absorb. On the stimulus package, if there is one,
Mm-hmm.
do you think that it would be, and I don't know, I don't know what all is in it right now, but would there be some benefit to having some sort of housing relief, either for the house owners, the renters, or even the rental property owners?
It's very tricky because what governments generally try not to do is get themselves involved in price or quantity decisions. What they like to do is provide payments or taxes against the decisions. So it's unknown right now that there would be like, let's say, a specific market infiltration. That's what I meant by price and quantity. That where they said you must sit at this price or you must hold at this quantity, meaning that you cannot evict anybody. This is a federal mandate. And that, in fact, what we're going to do for you is we're going to send you a check that I want you to specifically use for rent. It's very tricky to do that. We are hearing rumblings out of Congress that there might be another $1,200 coming per individual. That's the Democrat side of the aisle plan right now. If that ends up being something greater than zero, that indirectly helps the decision to stay in a home and also for a landlord to keep somebody there, because at least they think maybe for 1 or 2 more months, they'll be able to sort of linger on with the idea that that person or that household may be able to get their income back. It's very tricky. That's why I'm warning in this seminar today that we don't want to get too loose about housing not having a problem simply because housing prices have remained relatively stable or in good shape for right now. Summer is normally a time where housing prices are on the upswing. Interest rates are as low as they're going to get, and in fact, to my dismay, have continued to creep even lower, which has been just crazy historically. But the key here is recognizing that providing direct housing relief is something that government has usually not come into directly in our history, and I don't expect it in this package.
Okay, all right. So on that, can you see a new round of PPP to help businesses pay for rent?
I think we're going to see something that businesses are going to have the ability to use it for rent. Whether or not they do or not is going to be an open question. And if PPP ultimately needs to mix between jobs relief and business stability, then there's going to be probably another, if PPP comes in round 2 hard, it's probably going to have a mix just like PPP 1 had. So I would not expect it to be focused on rent, but it probably will have some component that's available for leasing payments or rent or something that has to do with your physical space.
Okay. Have you heard anything about capital gains holiday?
I've heard a lot of things, like we're going to have payroll tax reductions, potentially a capital gains holiday, potentially a capital gains reduction. Capital gains taxes are already relatively low in the United States, especially long-term capital gains, but it wouldn't shock me if we don't have some types of holidays or some relief there, because that seems to be where the Republicans want to see relief. Again, an indirect way of providing relief to households. Assume those conversations are happening. I haven't heard any specificity around that yet, but my supposition is that it's happening.
Okay. And how do you see training playing into all this, workforce training, and how colleges could maybe meet the demands?
Very tricky. As somebody who works at a college and works on the workforce development side and runs programs for a university, one of my biggest concerns is I'm trying to see the future as best as I can as to what jobs are going to be there. And if people start to ask me, well, what programs do you have? There's such a wide array of programs that we provide, but which ones are actually going to deliver the job skills that somebody's going to need going forward is still an open question. I think healthcare and manufacturing are still going to be on the front end of this recovery. So if you're looking on the community college side, those types of programs are probably going to be big. But if you have a tourism or a hospitality one, you're probably going to see with relatively low demand there for some time to come. So I'd say healthcare and manufacturing are going to be the two big ones on the front end.
Okay. All right. So it looks like we are at time. I don't see any other questions. If you do have some other questions that come up, please feel free to forward them to us, and we'll do our best to get them answered for you. Okay. Thanks,
Thanks,
everyone.
Vicki. Thanks, folks. Take care.